Hey guys, welcome to WIP Miniatures. In today's episode I'm going to show you how I built this, which is a Sanguinary Priest. In particular, we've actually used Greytide Studio conversion pieces from their Bloodlords range, just here for the backpack, the shoulder and some of the apothecary tools here. So yeah, let's jump into it.
To build the Sanguinary Priest, I started by cutting out the Space Marine from the sprue, so I actually had a frame to attach the Greytide customization bits from. Just a bit of a note, they're actually designed for Primaris scale miniatures only at this point in time, and you do need a Space Marine to kind of use for customization because they don't actually have a full miniature. They're actually parts that are designed to kind of augment and make your miniature your own, so to speak. So as you can see here in the video, I've cut out all the parts that I need for this, as well as going through the parts from the Greytide Miniature Kit. So the next step at this point in time is to give everything a bit of a trim and a clean up and tidy up all the parts. That step in itself is pretty straightforward. Most people kind of know how to do that. You just trim all the excess bits off, give everything a bit of a clean, mold lines and that. Something to maybe note also is because these Greytide miniature parts are resin, they might need a bit of a wash to get rid of any release agents. And it's not a bad idea when you're prepping your miniatures for painting to give them a bit of a once over as well, just to clean any residue or particulates that might come off from the cleaning process. So it's at this point now that I've actually cut out all the miniature parts from the sprue, cleaned up and adjusted all the parts from the Greytide miniatures. Now, prior to this part here, I've also given everything a wash and a clean to get any dust and particulates or residual release agents off. And I'm looking at sort of selecting some bases, which I also got from the Greytide miniature selection. They actually have, these are actually toppers, so you just glue them to a normal base. So as you can see here, I was just, as I was mentioning, just showing a few different examples of the toppers that I got with my Greytide miniature customization parts. Each of these toppers is actually scaled accordingly for the depending on the base size that you want. You can also get them round and oval in various different sizes. So they make really great additions to your miniature and a bit easier than sometimes building a base and detailing it. But you do need to prep the surface so that the actual base will glue on properly and make it a little bit easier when I'm sort of gluing it together. This is something I sort of did once I kind of got an opportunity to start gluing, that I actually look at putting everything together that way. So So as you can see here now, I've started the gluing. So yeah, using the Tamiya extra fine glue and a combination of super glue. So just something for people who probably aren't familiar with handling resin, you do need to use super glue to glue that together. You can't actually use any other sort of plastic glues because it won't hold properly. So you do end up using a combination of glues when actually assembling the miniature. So. It's kind of at this point when I start gluing on the parts from the Greytide customization kit that I'm actually also using super glue and an activator, or what they call a Kickstarter, just to make sure that the glue kind of activates quicker and everything kind of locks into place. And that's quite a little bit of a helpful tool that I've found just to kind of make things a bit easier when you're super gluing, just in case the glue doesn't take quickly and then the parts move while you're trying to sort of glue everything together. So as you can see, we've got the miniature finally assembled. You get some really quite great results using the Greytide miniature pieces. You get quite a unique look for this Sanguinary priest, especially with things like the goblet, the apothecary kit on the backpack, and all the other little bits and pieces that kind of make it quite unique. Now that it's actually glued together and sorted, all I need to do now is wait for the glue and any of the other bits and pieces to dry off properly, and then organize it for priming. As I said before, it's worthwhile making sure that the miniature is as clean as possible. That'll help with the next part, which is the priming stage of before we get into the actual painting. Once the primer has actually dried, the next step is to what's known as staining the miniature. So staining is basically a oil painting technique where you would apply a color through onto the canvas and sort of stain it a particular color and tone. In the case of miniature painting, this just with oil paints, what this does is set a baseline tone, define the shape of the miniature and any of the shadows and recesses. Um, when I stained the miniature for this Sanguinary priest, what I did is I used a combination of like a rusty yellow and sort of dark brown colors to kind of give it a bit of a weathered and sort of grim dark sort of finish, like it's very aged and weathered and beaten. Um, And by doing that, that means that it set that initial tone for the subsequent stages and applications of paint going forward. During the staining stage as well, I mean, I've made sure that the whole base has actually got a bit of a coverage with it, as it's the initial part that's kind of needing to be sort of done at this point in time. And going over it also as well, just with a little bit of a brush to kind of wick away any excess paint so that it's a nice clean finish. I've also used what's known as a painting medium, as you can see just in the top left-hand corner of the picture. What that does is it ensures that not only does it make the paint quite transparent, but it also at the same time too helps to dry the paint off a lot faster, because oil paints inherently have a long dry time, even with the miniature quality paints I'm using here from scale 75. So that'll at least mean that the next stages of the paint job will be a lot bit more efficient, because we won't have to wait for paint to dry going forward. So after doing the staining, pretty much straight into sponge chipping. So for this miniature, for the initial base coat, I've sponge chipped over the armor a sort of dark red. This allows me to kind of build up a bit of a base coat for the paint going forward, and sort of setting the tonal values of the actual armor, and that's being applied with the sponge. So sponge chipping technique is not or sponging is not a new technique. It's quite common, but it just allows you to give, in conjunction with the previous staining, a slightly more weathered look. And that way we can build up the tonal value. As you can see here, we're now building up a lighter color before we sort of move through to the next sort of parts where we highlights and that later on in the paint job. What I've actually done here also too is use the sponging technique on all the areas that, like the cloth of the loincloth, the Sanguinary priest's medical equipment and the apothecary backpack. All those areas have been actually applied with the sponge chipping technique as well, because that will, especially with the staining that we applied beforehand, increase a more weathered and sort of, I suppose, weathered and grimdark sort of look, so to speak. Generally speaking, where there's areas where I couldn't get with the sponge, I also use the paintbrush to kind of apply those areas as well, sort of just chipping or sort of tapping with the paintbrush just in areas, just to kind of build up those paint areas as well, so that we kind of got a nice even coverage, but still keeping that kind of weathered sort of effect that was created by the sponge. At this stage here, I've also put some paint on the base just to kind of start actually building up that color palette as well. Just basically a mixture of greens at this stage would create a nice contrast between the red armor of the Space Marine. Through most of the stages as well, I'm also using mediums to kind of help thin out the paints, but still give a little bit of consistency as far as that's concerned, and also kind of at least build up the ability to sort of paint the miniature faster with what we've been applying. Got it at this point now that I'm also starting to do some of the other effects. So I've actually started painting some of the gold onto the goblet, some of the armor trims, painting the gold on there as well, including all those things like the backpack and the aquila on the chest. For me, because I predominantly use oil paints for painting my miniatures. It's very hard to get hold of gold and silver oil paints. They're quite expensive. They're not always reliable. So what I actually do is I use a very fine pigment, gold pigment, and then mix that with medium or sometimes with a little bit of the paint to kind of give the effect that I want. If I want a slightly darker color, I'll put like paint in it. If I want just the clean color, I'll just use the medium and then just mix it accordingly. And that just initially is setting the actual base tones for the gold before I come in with any highlighting colors later in the painting. So in this case, I'm actually painting all the gold. I'll start moving through to painting all the metallics as well. So on the bolter and anywhere else on the miniature where it needs to have that touching up. So here I've actually, as you can see, when I painted the base originally, it was quite a very light green. So what I've actually done with this now is I've applied a mixture of grey, dark grey and black, and a little bit of a dark green in there, and then just worked that over the top of the base, almost basically like a wash. So ultimately washing the base, darkening down the actual green, so you've got more of a dark muted colour. By doing that as well, also it's sort of reduces that colour a bit and creates a bit more contrast. Once I've actually also applied this too, I've used a couple of kind of reductive techniques, like using a sponge, or in this case here, like a Q-tip, just to kind of wick away the excess wash, because you can use brushes to do that, but you can also, in this case, use things like Q-tips and stuff to kind of take away that and kind of ease that back a little bit so you don't lose too much of the initial colour that you've had before you've applied the wash. And it gives me an ability to kind of come in there and just kind of create the effect that I actually want to create with it. Spent quite a bit of time actually on the base, just as I said, painting kind of the initial sort of colours to kind of clean that all up, doing a little bit of sort of clean up work on the miniature as well. So just to kind of start pulling things together, tidying up some of the areas where there's been a bit of a area where you've got a little bit too much paint and stuff. You've lost some of the weathering as well, and it kind of just pushes that back in, makes it quite defined. We're also doing a little bit of, I suppose, highlighting in that sense, but the highlighting's quite subtle, as opposed to a lot of highlighting where it becomes quite thick or you get a lot of it. This is quite subtle, so it's just pushing the edges of that using a finer brush. We're kind of coming in now and just sort of tidying up our little areas as well. Most cases, it's just kind of starting to pull the miniature together, because in the beginning of it looks kind of very rough and just a bit disjointed, and as you kind of paint it, you're pulling the miniature together, adding more detail on it, cleaning things up, and just kind of pulling the miniature to that finished look that you're trying to achieve. There's with the Greytide miniature conversion pieces, there's quite a lot of little fine details that you can kind of come across as well that just accentuate and push the detail of the miniature a bit more. So at this sort of stage now, it's just, as I said, just picking those details out as we get closer to kind of finishing up the miniature and sort of finalizing the overall look. They're actually really easy to work with. I found that this kind of gave that miniature a bit of uniqueness as opposed to some of the builds that are actually out there. As you can see here, as I've just kind of using the sponge to kind of wick away some of the excess paints as I'm kind of working in there. The brings it all kind of together, makes the overall piece kind of a bit more cohesive. And you get a little bit of readability as well over the overall miniature when you kind of use it to sort of separate that up. So and a little bit of blending here and there just to kind of smooth things out. So in this area here, I'm actually going back over and pushing some of that weathering out. So I've taken that same weathering type wash color again and just kind of touched that up on certain spots. So it's still pushing the weathering a bit, because when you kind of doing painting and stuff, sometimes you can lose that effect. So this is just kind of reapplying some of those effects in places and overall just kind of giving it a nice blend in through. I didn't want to kind of lose too much of that grim dark sort of weathered look. And make it too clean, not for the initial sort of feel I wanted for this particular miniature. So, but at the same time too, I also didn't want to look too messy, because there's the tendency to sometimes paint a really good miniature, then cover it in washes and stuff, and then call that a finished job as being grimdark. And with oil paints, you actually get that grimdark feel straight away with oil paints, because they inherently darken off when you paint them. And so your colours will actually get a little bit more muted, and that sort of weathered age look kind of becomes a bit more apparent, without having to use a lot of washes or apply a lot of heavy duty sort of techniques to the overall look of the miniature. It's kind of at this point with the miniature where I'm actually just finishing up all the details. So this is coming in with all like the gold pigment again, and silver pigment later, where I'm actually painting all the highlights on the miniature and doing all those sort of details on the backpack, sort of, and the rest of the miniature just painting up all the trims and pieces just to kind of finish it off. Inherently with the paints that I'm using, because as I've said before, they go quite dark to the oil paint. Sometimes you need to push that up a little bit just to kind of lift it. And it's really good with the things like the silvers and stuff to kind of really push out certain aspects of the miniature, especially on things like the metallics and the gold, where you will get that detail coming through. Back to doing some details on the base, and kind of cleaning up the overall miniature as well. It's kind of with the oil paints, because of the way they work, where you can kind of do a couple of different things. You can kind of paint it, leave it to dry and come back again, and sort of apply paints accordingly, or do a little bit of wet blending and stuff like that. You kind of come back and forth to the different parts of the miniature, sometimes not as fast as you would if you were painting with acrylics, because of the fact that the paint actually does take it sometimes a little bit longer to dry. But it also gives you a chance too, for when the oil paint has had a chance to sit a little bit and dry, to sort of see exactly where things are going to be going forward. That with acrylics is obviously a lot faster process, but you still want to actually get that chance to kind of pick at the miniature, kind of pick out what you want to be doing, looking at the different sort of steps here and there, and kind of just getting that all sort of sorted. So I've finished painting the miniature, and I've just been reflecting on kind of the end result as I clean up my tools. Very happy with the result overall, and look forward to what the next kind of lot of miniatures are going to look like going forward. So stay tuned, and I'll see you guys soon.